It was a warm Saturday afternoon when the kids in the neighborhood gathered at the Johnson family's house. The small suburban street was filled with the sounds of laughter, music, and excited chatter as they celebrated a birthday party for 10-year-old Jamal Johnson. The backyard was decorated with bright balloons, a table full of snacks, and a cake shaped like a race car, Jamal's favorite. His friends were all invited, and the Johnsons had worked hard to make this day special for their son. Jamal, who had been eagerly planning the party for weeks, felt overjoyed seeing all his friends arrive. He ran around the yard, playing games and laughing with his classmates. The other kids followed his lead, joining in the fun as the music played, and everyone enjoyed the delicious food. While the children were having fun, there was one person in the neighborhood who was not happy about the celebration. Mrs. Harrison, a woman in her 60s who lived a few houses down from the Johnsons, had been watching the party from her window. She didn't like what she saw: the noise, the laughter, and the group of kids having a good time. In fact, she didn't like any of the parties the Johnsons threw, and she had often complained about them to other neighbors in the past. As the afternoon went on, the noise from the party grew louder. The children were playing a game of tag, running around the yard, and shouting with excitement. Mrs. Harrison's frustration grew, and she couldn't stand the thought of another fun day in the Johnson family's backyard. Her irritation reached its peak when Jamal's younger brother, Malik, accidentally kicked a soccer ball into her flower bed. The ball rolled across the grass and knocked over some of her prized flowers, which was the final straw for Mrs. Harrison. In her anger, Mrs. Harrison decided to take action. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, intending to ruin the party once and for all. She explained to the dispatcher that there was a loud, out-of-control gathering happening next door and that the children were being disruptive. Mrs. Harrison didn't mention the reason for her anger or the fact that the children were just playing a game in their own yard. Instead, she made it sound like an emergency, exaggerating the situation in the hope that the police would arrive and put an end to the fun. Meanwhile, the party continued, and no one had any idea that Mrs. Harrison had called the police. Jamal and his friends were laughing and playing, while his parents, Sarah and Michael, chatted with some of the other adults who had gathered to celebrate. It was a peaceful and joyful afternoon for everyone involved. As the minutes ticked by, Mrs. Harrison anxiously waited inside her house, hoping that the police would arrive soon. She was convinced that the Johnsons were disrespecting her peaceful neighborhood, and she didn't care about the consequences. In her mind, she thought that having the police show up would teach them a lesson. Little did she know, the Johnson family and the children at the party had no intention of causing trouble. They were simply enjoying a day of fun, celebrating a special occasion with laughter and happiness. The neighborhood had always been quiet, and everyone knew each other, but Mrs. Harrison's actions were about to change things in ways she hadn't anticipated. While the party continued in full swing, the community was about to be faced with an unexpected situation that no one saw coming. Would Mrs. Harrison's complaint make a difference, or would the party continue as planned? Would the police handle the situation, or would they see through her motives? The answers to those questions would soon be revealed when the police arrived, and the neighborhood would never be the same again. As the sun began to set, the party was in full swing. The music played on, the kids laughed louder, and the air was filled with the smell of hot dogs and hamburgers grilling on the barbecue. Jamal ran past his parents, laughing as he chased after his friends, completely unaware that trouble was brewing just a few houses away. Meanwhile, Mrs. Harrison stood by her window, nervously watching the party from behind the curtains. She had been waiting for what felt like hours. She had called the police, but the party still showed no sign of stopping. Her anger had clouded her judgment, and she had convinced herself that the only way to restore peace was to have the police intervene. Finally, the sound of sirens broke the peaceful evening. Jamal's parents looked up, startled. A police car had pulled up to the curb just in front of their house, its lights flashing in the dimming light of the evening. Jamal's dad, Michael, who had been chatting with the other parents, frowned in confusion. He didn't understand what could have gone wrong. Everything seemed normal. Two officers stepped out of the police car. They were both men, dressed in uniforms with badges gleaming in the fading sunlight. As they walked up the driveway, Sarah, Jamal's mother, stepped forward, a bit unsure of what was happening. She greeted them politely, but with some hesitation. "Good evening, officers," Sarah said, trying to remain calm. "Is there something wrong?" The officers, with serious expressions, looked around the yard. They could hear the laughter and the music, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. One of the officers glanced at the other, clearly unsure of what to do next. "We received a complaint about noise and disturbance from a neighbor," the officer said, his voice firm. "Is everything all right here?" Michael stepped forward to explain. "It's just a birthday party for our son, officer. It's a small gathering, nothing too loud or out of control. Everyone's just having a good time." The officers glanced at each other again. They didn't seem convinced, but they didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily. They asked a few more questions, checking in on the party and the guests to see if things were really as peaceful as Michael had said. Meanwhile, some of the kids noticed the police car and paused their games, glancing nervously at the officers. Jamal, who had been playing tag with his friends, walked up to his parents, his expression a mix of confusion and concern. "Mom, Dad, what's going on? Why are the police here?" Michael crouched down to Jamal's level, giving him a reassuring smile. "It's nothing to worry about, son. Some people just don't understand the fun we're having, but everything's fine." The officer who had been speaking with Sarah looked around the yard one last time. He saw children sitting on the grass, playing with toys, and others running around, all smiling and enjoying themselves. The scene was calm, nothing like what Mrs. Harrison had described in her call. The officers could tell there was no real reason to get involved. After a moment of silence, the officer spoke again. "All right," he said, his tone softening. "It looks like everything is fine here. We just wanted to check in." The other officer nodded in agreement. "We just need to make sure that no one is causing any trouble. But it seems like it's just a birthday party, as you said." Sarah and Michael both breathed a sigh of relief. They smiled, but their faces showed how nervous they had been. The officers turned to leave, but not before one of them paused and added, "If there are any further issues, feel free to reach out. But it looks like everything is under control here." As the officers walked back to their patrol car, Sarah and Michael stood there, still processing what had just happened. The police had left without taking any action, but they knew the whole situation could have easily escalated. They felt fortunate that the officers had seen the party for what it was, a harmless gathering of friends and family. Back at the front door, the neighborhood kids were whispering to one another, still unsure of why the police had come in the first place. Jamal, still looking puzzled, asked, "Who called the cops?" Michael and Sarah exchanged glances, but neither of them answered right away. They didn't want to bring negativity into the celebration. As the police car drove off down the street, the music resumed, and the party picked up where it had left off. But a quiet unease lingered in the air. Everyone was a little more cautious now, and the tension that had arrived with the sirens had not entirely disappeared. The rest of the evening went on without further incidents. The party continued, the children danced, and Jamal enjoyed his special day with his friends and family. But for the Johnsons, the visit from the police had left a bitter aftertaste. They couldn't help but wonder who had called the authorities and why. After the police left, the mood at Jamal's birthday party shifted slightly. The children went back to playing, but the adults stood around talking in small groups, exchanging nervous glances. Sarah and Michael, although relieved that the police had left without causing any more problems, couldn't shake the unease they felt. They had never experienced something like this before, and it had left them questioning their peaceful neighborhood. As the evening went on, more neighbors began to stop by to wish Jamal a happy birthday. Some had heard about the police visit, and the topic quickly became the main subject of conversation. Most were supportive, reassuring Sarah and Michael that they had done nothing wrong. But others were surprised, as they had always known the Johnson family to be quiet and respectful. "I can't believe someone called the police," said Mrs. Baker, who lived a few houses down. "That's just ridiculous. You were just having a party." Sarah smiled but didn't respond immediately. She was still processing what had happened. "It's strange. We've lived here for years, and we've never had an issue like this before." Mrs. Baker shook her head. "Some people are just looking for trouble. This is a good neighborhood. I don't know why anyone would do something like that." But as the night went on, it became clear that the situation wasn't just going to be forgotten. The more the neighbors talked, the more they realized that Mrs. Harrison, the woman who had called the police, had done so out of pure frustration. The community began to discuss how they could address the situation, whether it was confronting Mrs. Harrison directly or finding a way to address the larger issue of intolerance in their neighborhood. The next morning, Michael decided to take action. He knew that the only way to keep things from escalating further was to have an honest conversation with Mrs. Harrison. He didn't want any more misunderstandings to grow out of control. He also wanted to make it clear that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable in their neighborhood. With a deep breath, Michael walked to Mrs. Harrison's house. He was prepared for an uncomfortable conversation, but he knew it was necessary. As he knocked on her door, his heart raced. Mrs. Harrison opened the door with a surprised look on her face. "Hello, Mrs. Harrison," Michael said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful. "I wanted to talk to you about last night." Mrs. Harrison's eyes widened slightly, and she stepped back, allowing him inside. "Of course, Michael. Come in." Michael hesitated but stepped inside, looking around the neat, quiet home. He could sense that Mrs. Harrison was on edge. He decided to get straight to the point. "Last night, we had a birthday party for Jamal, and we were shocked when the police showed up. I understand you called them, and I just wanted to ask why." Mrs. Harrison seemed taken aback by the directness of the question. She crossed her arms defensively but sighed. "I didn't like the noise. It was too loud, and I couldn't get any peace. I thought the party was getting out of control." Michael was taken aback. He knew the party had been loud, but it was just a group of kids having fun. He tried to explain this to Mrs. Harrison. "I understand that it might have been noisy," he said, "but it was just a group of kids enjoying a birthday. No one was being disrespectful, and everyone was safe. We never meant to cause any problems." Mrs. Harrison's face softened slightly, but she didn't seem to fully grasp the situation. "I didn't see it that way. It just didn't seem right to me." Michael looked at her carefully. He could see that Mrs. Harrison was genuinely upset, but there was something more to it. Her discomfort went beyond the noise. He decided to ask a more direct question, hoping to get to the heart of the issue. "Mrs. Harrison, do you have a problem with the kids because of their race?" For a long moment, there was silence in the room. Mrs. Harrison's expression shifted. She seemed to hesitate, unsure of how to respond. Then she looked down at her hands. "I didn't mean it like that," she said quietly, her voice faltering. I don't know. I'd always been bothered by the way things have changed around here." Michael nodded slowly. "I understand that things can feel different, but we're all neighbors, and we're all part of the same community. We have to learn to live together." There was an awkward silence before Mrs. Harrison spoke again. "Maybe I was wrong. I didn't think about it that way. I guess I've been holding on to some old feelings, and I didn't know how to deal with them." Michael took a deep breath. "It's not too late to change, Mrs. Harrison. We can all make an effort to understand each other better. I want to make sure that the kids can play without fear of being treated unfairly." After Michael's conversation with Mrs. Harrison, things started to shift in the neighborhood. It wasn't an immediate change, but a small but significant step in the right direction. Mrs. Harrison's apology, though reluctant, had opened the door to a more honest discussion about the situation. Michael was hopeful, but he knew it would take time for people's attitudes to truly change. Over the next few days, Word spread throughout the neighborhood. Some people were shocked to hear about Mrs. Harrison's actions, while others were more understanding, knowing that the issue wasn't just about a loud party. It was about the deeper problem of racial tension that had quietly existed in the area. The Johnson family, however, remained focused on the bigger picture. Jamal's birthday party had sparked something more important than just a celebration. It had shown the community how easily misunderstandings could happen, and how crucial it was to address them head-on. The following weekend, Tanya, who had been one of the first people to speak out during the initial meeting about the incident, invited everyone from the neighborhood to a community picnic. Her goal was simple: bring everyone together. She wanted to show that it didn't matter where people came from or what they looked like. What mattered was coming together and working toward a more understanding community. The picnic was held at the local park, and as the sun shone brightly, more neighbors than expected showed up. People from all walks of life gathered with blankets, picnic baskets, and children running around. There was a feeling of unity that hadn't been there before, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like the community was genuinely connected. Sarah and Michael arrived with Jamal and his siblings, and they were surprised to see Mrs. Harrison among the guests. She had shown up, offering a quiet but sincere apology once again. This time, her presence felt different. She didn't just apologize to Michael. She made the effort to approach the Johnson family and personally spoke with Jamal. "Jamal, I want to say again that I'm sorry for what happened," Mrs. Harrison said, her voice soft but sincere. "I didn't understand before, but I do now. I'll make sure I'm more mindful from now on." Jamal, who had always been polite and forgiving, smiled and nodded. "It's okay, Mrs. Harrison. I'm just happy you're here." The moment was small, but meaningful. It marked the beginning of a shift. Mrs. Harrison wasn't the only one who had changed, though. Others in the neighborhood started to reflect on how they had handled the situation, and many made an effort to show more kindness and understanding. As the afternoon wore on, the kids played together, the laughter echoing through the park. People were talking, sharing stories, and getting to know each other better. Michael looked around, noticing how much more connected everyone seemed. He was proud of what they had accomplished. Later in the day, Tanya stood up to speak. She wasn't one to ask for attention, but she knew this moment was important. She wanted to acknowledge everyone's effort to be part of the solution. "I'm so happy to see all of you here," she began, her voice steady but warm. "What happened with the Johnson family opened our eyes to how easy it is to misjudge each other. But today, we are proving that we can be better. We're proving that we are stronger together." There was a round of applause, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like the neighborhood was truly united. The community wasn't perfect, but it was moving toward something better. Michael stood beside Tanya, nodding in agreement. He knew this was just the start, but it was a good start. As the sun began to set, the picnic came to an end, and people slowly packed up their things. But the sense of unity that had filled the air lingered. Mrs. Harrison, who had come to the picnic feeling uncertain, left feeling hopeful. She had learned a valuable lesson, that treating others with kindness and respect was the only way forward. The Johnson family went home that evening feeling proud of what they had done. They hadn't just stood up for their rights, they had made a difference in their community. They had opened hearts and minds, one small step at a time. And they knew that as long as they continued to stand together, they could face any challenge that came their way. And so, the neighborhood moved forward with a renewed sense of purpose, united by a common goal, to make sure that everyone was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. As the weeks passed, the change in the neighborhood was more noticeable. The Johnson family felt a new sense of calm and unity. Jamal's birthday party, which had caused such a stir, now seemed like a distant memory. But what it had started, conversations, reflection, and growth, was still very much alive. The community had come together in ways that no one had expected. Tanya's picnic had sparked something in people. It wasn't just about sharing food and spending time together. It was about understanding each other, building trust, and finding common ground. Mrs. Harrison, once the source of tension, had continued her efforts to change. She started reaching out to her neighbors, especially the Johnsons. One afternoon, she knocked on their door, holding a small gift in her hand. "Hello, Michael, Sarah," Mrs. Harrison greeted, her tone softer than before. "I just wanted to apologize again, and I wanted to do something small to show that I'm really trying to do better." Sarah opened the door and smiled warmly. "Thank you, Mrs. Harrison. You really don't have to do that, but it's kind of you." Inside the small gift was a potted plant, nothing extravagant, but it felt meaningful. The gesture was a sign that she was committed to making amends. Michael accepted the gift, and they exchanged a few words before Mrs. Harrison left. It wasn't a big moment, but it was significant. It showed that people were trying to improve, to make things better for everyone. Around the same time, other members of the community were also starting to notice changes in themselves. Neighbors who had never spoken much before were beginning to reach out to each other. Conversations that were once difficult were now happening openly. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And in small, steady ways, the neighborhood was healing. Jamal, who had been confused by all the attention surrounding his birthday party, was now proud of the change he had unknowingly helped bring about. His friends at school had even started talking about the lessons they had learned from his party and the police visit. They spoke about standing up for what's right, being kind to others, and not judging people based on where they come from. At school, Jamal's teacher noticed the difference too. "Jamal, I've seen a lot of positive changes in you lately," she said one morning after class. "Your kindness and understanding are really inspiring. You've helped everyone around you think differently." Jamal smiled, feeling proud of the way things had turned out. He never wanted anything more than to enjoy his birthday, but now he understood that sometimes the most important moments in life came from unexpected places. The city's police department also began implementing new community engagement efforts. The officers who had been called to the Johnsons' house were now attending neighborhood meetings, listening to residents' concerns, and taking part in community building activities. They had learned that their presence could either help or hurt a situation, and it was up to them to make a positive impact. The Johnson family, too, continued to be active in their neighborhood. Michael and Sarah started attending community meetings to help foster conversations about fairness and respect. Their goal was simple: to ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, felt safe and valued in their neighborhood. One evening, as Sarah was sitting on the porch with Michael, watching Jamal play with his friends across the street, she reflected on everything that had happened. "You know, it's been a tough couple of weeks," she said, her voice thoughtful. "But I'm proud of us. We've made a difference, even in small ways, and it feels good to know that we're making the world a little better for Jamal and all the kids in this community." Michael nodded. "We're showing them that kindness can go a long way. It's not always easy, but it's worth it." Together, they watched the sun set, feeling a renewed sense of hope. The neighborhood had its challenges, but it also had people who were willing to stand up for what was right. People who believed in kindness, understanding, and the power of community. As the days went by, the lessons from the Johnson family's experience continued to resonate in the neighborhood. It wasn't just about fixing one mistake. It was about building something stronger, something better. A community where everyone felt welcome and respected. And even though there was still work to be done, they knew that they were on the right path. With each new day, the neighborhood grew closer. And in the hearts of everyone involved, there was the quiet but powerful hope that together, they could continue to make a difference. The changes in the neighborhood were becoming more noticeable each day. While things were far from perfect, the small steps the community had taken toward understanding and kindness were beginning to show results. The kids who had been at Jamal's birthday party were still laughing and playing together, their friendships growing stronger as they learned from the situation. The parents, too, were forming new bonds, exchanging ideas and supporting one another in ways that hadn't happened before. Jamal, who had always been an easygoing child, found himself feeling more connected to his neighbors than ever before. It wasn't just about the fun of playing outside or going to school anymore. It was about knowing that his family mattered and that people cared about their well-being. That meant a lot to him, especially after the tension caused by the police visit. His friends had been talking a lot at school, not just about what had happened during his birthday party, but about how people sometimes misunderstood each other. They were talking about how the world could be better if everyone was kinder, no matter who they were or where they came from. Jamal felt proud to be part of that conversation. It made him see how much influence even small actions could have. At home, Michael and Sarah continued to help lead their community toward better understanding. They kept attending meetings and talking to people. Michael had even started a small group with some of the dads in the neighborhood. They met on weekends to talk about how they could be better role models for their kids and how they could make the neighborhood a better place for everyone. One Saturday afternoon, Sarah organized a small get-together at their house. It was a casual event, just some snacks, drinks, and games for the kids. But it was an opportunity for neighbors to come together again and build on the connections that had been made at the picnic. Mrs. Harrison, the woman who had called the police, was also there. Her presence was a little awkward at first, but she was determined to show that she was making an effort. The event was a success. People chatted, laughed, and even shared stories about their childhoods. Mrs. Harrison approached Michael and Sarah, her demeanor less guarded than it had been in their earlier conversation. "I just want to thank you both again," she said, her voice sincere. "I know I've caused some trouble in the past, but I'm really trying to do better. I appreciate you giving me a chance." Michael smiled and shook his hand. "Everyone makes mistakes. What matters is what we do after that." Sarah added, "We're all in this together. The most important thing is that we keep trying." The event reminded everyone that change didn't have to be sudden or grand. It could happen over time, through small conversations, efforts to understand one another, and showing kindness in everyday moments. The kids ran around the yard, laughing, while the adults watched from the porch, chatting more comfortably now. There were no police sirens this time, only laughter and the quiet sound of neighbors coming together. As the evening ended, everyone said their goodbyes, but there was something different in the air. The neighborhood felt warmer, more welcoming. People were more open to listening, to talking, and to making things better. Michael and Sarah were happy to see the change, but they knew there was still work to do. The next morning, Michael and Sarah sat on the porch again, watching Jamal and his friends play. They were proud of what had been achieved, but they knew that lasting change would take time. However, they had taken the first steps towards something better, and that gave them hope for the future. The neighborhood wasn't perfect yet, but the people who lived there were starting to understand that they could make a difference. Together, they would continue to build a stronger, kinder community, one small step at a time. It wasn't just about ending a misunderstanding. It was about creating something lasting, a space where everyone could feel welcome and valued. And in that, they found a sense of peace and unity that would carry them through whatever came next. As weeks passed, the neighborhood continued to grow stronger. The changes were not dramatic, but they were real. People who had once been strangers now shared greetings and friendly waves as they passed each other on the street. The small actions, the smiles, the conversations were slowly building something that had been missing before: trust. Jamal's family had become an important part of this shift. After the events surrounding his birthday party, his parents, Michael and Sarah, had worked hard to create an environment where people felt welcomed and heard. They organized regular get-togethers and encouraged open discussions about their hopes for the future. The community began to feel more like a team, each person contributing in their own way. One afternoon, Michael sat with Jamal in the backyard, watching as his son played with his friends. The sound of laughter filled the air, and Michael couldn't help but smile. It felt good to see Jamal so happy, knowing that the neighborhood was becoming a place where everyone could enjoy themselves without fear of being judged. "Dad, do you think things will always be this good?" Jamal asked, still running after his friends. Michael paused, thinking carefully. I hope so, son, but we have to keep working at it. The way things were before, with people not understanding each other, it wasn't right. But the more we talk, the more we listen, the better we'll all understand each other. Jamal nodded thoughtfully, his young face showing a maturity beyond his years. He had learned that the world could be a complicated place, but the simple actions of kindness and understanding could make a big difference. And in the weeks that followed, Jamal carried those lessons with him, sharing them with his friends and even with his classmates at school. As for Mrs. Harrison, she had continued to make an effort. At first, she had been embarrassed about her actions, but as she spent more time talking with her neighbors, she began to understand the importance of accepting and respecting others. The change in her was slow, but it was there. She joined the neighborhood meetings, listened more than she spoke, and often found herself reflecting on how she could be a better person, a better neighbor. One evening, Mrs. Harrison knocked on the Johnsons' door again. This time, she brought something a little more personal than the plant from before. She had baked a batch of cookies and wanted to share them with the family as a gesture of goodwill. Michael, Sarah, she began, her voice softer than before. I just wanted to say thank you again. I've learned a lot over these past few weeks. I want to be someone who contributes to this community, not someone who causes trouble. Sarah welcomed her inside, a warm smile on her face. We're happy to have you, Mrs. Harrison. Thank you for the cookies. Over the following months, more neighbors continued to show their support for one another. Even those who had once felt unsure about the changes were starting to warm up to the idea of a more inclusive and welcoming neighborhood. The bond that had formed between the Johnson family and their neighbors continued to grow, and it was clear that the efforts to build a stronger community were paying off. Jamal's birthday party, which had initially caused so much tension, had ultimately become the catalyst for something much greater. The community had learned valuable lessons about empathy, respect, and the power of coming together in times of conflict. And while there would still be challenges ahead, the people in this neighborhood were now more prepared to face them together. As the seasons changed, Michael and Sarah could look out at their yard, watching Jamal and his friends play, knowing that the changes they had worked so hard for had made their home a better place. The laughter of children, the smiles of neighbors, and the peaceful sense of unity in the air were all signs that their efforts had mattered. The road ahead would not always be easy, but as long as they stayed united, there was no challenge too great to overcome. And as for Jamal, he had learned that standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult, can create ripples that spread through an entire community, leaving it stronger and more connected than before.